The cold Seattle wind whistled through the empty streets as Officer James Martinez guided his patrol car through downtown. The clock on his dashboard read 11:45 p.m., just another quiet night shift, or so he thought. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalks, and most businesses had already closed their doors for the night. Martinez had been on the force for 8 years now, and he knew every corner of his beat like the back of his hand. As he drove past Central Park, something caught his eye. There, under the glow of a flickering streetlight, was a figure huddled on a park bench. The sight wasn't unusual in downtown Seattle, but something about this particular scene made Martinez slow down his patrol car. He pulled over and grabbed his flashlight. Department policy required him to check on anyone sleeping in public spaces. As he stepped out of his warm car, the chilly autumn air bit at his face. His boots crunched on fallen leaves as he approached the bench, creating the only sound in the otherwise silent park. The figure on the bench was wrapped in what looked like an old military jacket, worn and faded but still bearing traces of its original camouflage pattern. Martinez could see patches sewn onto the sleeve, though they were too dirty to read clearly. The man was using a worn backpack as a pillow, its straps frayed from heavy use. "Sir," Martinez called out, keeping his voice firm but gentle. He'd learned over the years that tone could make all the difference in these situations. When there was no response, he moved his flashlight beam slightly higher, trying to avoid shining it directly in the man's face. The sleeping figure stirred, and Martinez watched as he slowly sat up. The officer noticed how the man moved, deliberate and controlled, despite having just woken up. It reminded him of his uncle Robert, who'd served in the military. There was something about the way veterans carried themselves that you couldn't miss once you knew what to look for. "Evening, sir," Martinez said, lowering his flashlight slightly. "I'm Officer Martinez with the Seattle PD. I'm going to need to see some identification." He kept his distance, giving the man space to fully wake up and process the situation. The park bench's occupant blinked a few times, adjusting to consciousness. His face was weathered, but his eyes were sharp and alert despite having just woken up. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, movements careful and telegraphed, another habit Martinez recognized from his interactions with veterans. "Yes, officer," the man replied, his voice carrying a hint of a southern accent. "Let me get that for you." His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his wallet, but Martinez noticed it wasn't from fear or nervous energy. There was something else there, something that made the officer's trained eye look closer. The wallet was old leather, cracked and worn, but well maintained. As the man opened it, Martinez caught sight of something that made him pause, a glimpse of military ID tucked behind a transparent plastic window. The man carefully removed his identification and handed it over. Under the beam of his flashlight, Martinez read the name, Thompson, Michael R., United States Marine Corps. The ID was a few years old but legitimate. Martinez had seen enough military IDs to spot a fake, and this one was real. As he studied the ID, he couldn't help but notice how the photograph showed a different man, younger, clean-shaven, with a crisp uniform and proud stance. The contrast with the person sitting before him told a story all its own. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees above them. Martinez noticed how Thompson pulled his jacket tighter around himself, trying to ward off the cold. The officer's hand moved toward the citation book in his back pocket. He had a job to do, after all. The city's no camping ordinance was clear, and he was supposed to issue a citation. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the military ID still in his hand, or maybe it was the way Thompson sat there quietly, maintaining perfect eye contact despite his situation. There was dignity in his posture, even sitting on a park bench in the middle of the night. Little did Martinez know, this routine check was about to become one of the most memorable encounters of his career, and the story that would follow would change not just his perspective, but the lives of both men forever. Officer Martinez studied the military ID in his hand, running his thumb across its worn edges. The plastic was scratched, but the details were clear. Thompson had been a Marine Corps sergeant. Something about the way Thompson held himself, even in his current state, showed that military bearing never really goes away. "How long did you serve, Mr. Thompson?" Martinez asked, his voice softening slightly. He'd learned from experience that showing genuine interest often helped build trust in these situations. The park was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant traffic. 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days, Thompson replied without hesitation, as if he counted every single one of those days. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking as he reached to take back his ID. Martinez noticed how Thompson's fingers trembled when they brushed against his, not from the cold, and not from fear either. The officer's flashlight beam caught something else, a small pin on Thompson's jacket collar. It was partially hidden under the worn fabric, but Martinez recognized it immediately. A Purple Heart. His Uncle Robert had one just like it, earned in a different war, but carrying the same weight of sacrifice. Thompson must have noticed Martinez looking at the pin because he touched it briefly, almost unconsciously. "Got that one outside Kandahar," he said quietly, his eyes focusing on something far beyond the park bench. "Lost 3 good friends that day, saved 2 others." He stopped there, but his expression said more than words ever could. Martinez switched off his flashlight, letting the streetlight above them provide softer illumination. Sometimes darkness made it easier to talk, he'd learned. Thompson's face showed the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, the kind that comes from carrying too many memories for too long. As Thompson spoke, his southern accent became more pronounced, like he was slipping back in time. "Was a team leader," he continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Had 6 men under my command. Good men, young men." He paused, swallowing hard. Too young, some of them. The tremor in Thompson's hands grew more noticeable as he reached into his backpack. Martinez instinctively tensed, police training kicking in, but relaxed when Thompson pulled out a small, worn photograph. The edges were frayed, and the color had faded, but the image was clear enough. 6 Marines in full combat gear, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a desert backdrop. They were smiling, their faces young and full of life. "That's my team," Thompson said, handling the photo with gentle care. This was taken 2 days before. His voice trailed off, and he carefully tucked the photo away again. The trembling in his hands was worse now, and Martinez recognized the signs of what his uncle called the shakes, something many veterans dealt with when memories became too vivid. Martinez noticed other details now, the way Thompson's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, how he positioned himself to keep his back against the bench's backrest, how he slightly flinched when a car backfired in the distance. These weren't just homeless behaviors, they were combat instincts that never quite went away. "You married, officer?" Thompson asked suddenly, changing the subject. His voice had a different tone now, like he was trying to pull himself back to the present. Martinez noticed a tan line on Thompson's left ring finger, a story of its own waiting to be told. The question caught Martinez off guard, not because it was unusual, but because of how Thompson asked it, like one professional talking to another, momentarily bridging the gap between their current circumstances. There was something in Thompson's eyes that spoke of better days, of a life that once included more than just a park bench and a worn backpack. As the night grew colder around them, Martinez realized this wasn't going to be a simple citation. The man before him wasn't just another statistic to be processed and forgotten. Thompson's story was starting to unfold, revealing layers of complexity that no police report could ever capture. And with each passing moment, the weight of the citation book in Martinez's back pocket felt heavier and heavier. Martinez reached for his citation book, more out of habit than intention. The leather cover felt cold in his hands as he pulled it out. Thompson watched the movement with tired eyes, but there was no protest in his expression, just quiet acceptance, the kind that comes from facing too many battles to count. "Before you write that up," Thompson said softly, "mind if I tell you something?" His voice had changed, carrying a weight that made Martinez's hand pause over the blank citation. The officer nodded, sensing that what was coming next needed to be heard. "I never thought I'd end up here," Thompson began, gesturing at the park bench. "Had a good life once. House in Tennessee, nice little place with a porch swing and everything." He smiled faintly at the memory, his eyes focused on something far beyond the park's boundaries. A police siren wailed in the distance, and Thompson's body tensed automatically. He took a deep breath, the kind they teach you to take when trying to stay calm. 3 tours in Afghanistan, he continued. First 2 were tough, but we made it through. Third one, he paused, run your hand through his graying hair. Third one was different. Martinez quietly put away his citation book and sat on the other end of the bench. Sometimes, he knew, the best thing a police officer could do was listen. The streetlight above them flickered, casting shifting shadows across Thompson's face as he spoke. "Got hit by an IED outside a small village," Thompson said, his voice steady but distant. "Lost 2 of my best friends that day. Saved 3 others, they tell me. Don't remember much of it myself." He touched his right leg unconsciously. "Woke up in Germany 2 weeks later with a purple heart and more metal in my leg than bone." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees above them. Thompson pulled his jacket tighter, but Martinez noticed it wasn't just the cold making him shiver. Some memories he knew from his uncle's stories never stopped burning. "They patched me up good," Thompson continued, tapping his leg. "Physical therapy got me walking again. But the other stuff," he tapped his temple this time, "that's harder to fix. Started having nightmares. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't focus. Wife tried to help, bless her heart, but..." His voice trailed off, and he stared at the tan line on his ring finger. A group of late-night partiers walked past, their laughter echoing through the park. Thompson's eyes tracked their movement automatically, his body tensing slightly until they passed. Old habits, Martinez realized, those survival instincts that never quite turn off. "The doctors called it PTSD," Thompson said, pronouncing each letter carefully like they were foreign words. "Prescribed pills, lots of them. Tried to work through it. Had a good job at a construction company, they liked hiring vets. But the nightmares got worse. Started missing work. Couldn't handle the loud noises, the machinery." He pulled out the old photograph again, looking at it with a mixture of pride and pain. "These boys here, they still visit me in my dreams. Sometimes they're laughing, like in this picture. Sometimes they're..." He carefully tucked the photo away, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Lost the job first," Thompson continued, his voice getting quieter. "Then the house. Wife stuck around longer than most would have, but watching someone battle their own mind, it takes a toll." He showed Martinez his phone. "An old model, but well-maintained. She still checks in sometimes, makes sure I'm alive. Good woman. Deserved better than what I could give her." Martinez noticed how Thompson organized everything he owned with military precision even now. His backpack was packed neatly, clothes folded despite their wear. The small things, Martinez realized, that helped a person hold onto who they used to be. "You know what the hardest part is, officer?" Thompson asked, looking directly at Martinez for the first time in a while. "It's not the cold, or the hunger, or even the memories. It's walking past people every day, people I fought to protect, and being invisible to them. Being the guy they crossed the street to avoid." The truth of those words hung heavy in the night air. Martinez thought about all the times he'd driven past people on benches without stopping, about all the stories he might have missed. The citation book in his back pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Thompson shifted on the bench, wincing slightly as he adjusted his position. The old war injury in his leg was acting up again, it always did in cold weather. Martinez noticed but pretended not to, understanding how pride works. The veteran had already shared more than most would. "You're probably wondering why I'm out here tonight," Thompson said, his breath visible in the cold air. He pulled a wrinkled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, handling it like it was made of gold. "Got an appointment at the VA tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock sharp." Martinez leaned forward slightly, interested. The paper was a VA appointment letter, creased from being folded and unfolded many times, but the date and time were clearly visible under the streetlight. "Been waiting 3 months for this slot," Thompson continued, carefully refolding the letter. "Called them every week. Stayed on hold for hours sometimes. The lady at the desk, she's nice, tries her best. But they're overwhelmed, she says. Too many of us coming back broken." He gestured to his backpack, which Martinez now noticed was positioned perfectly within arm's reach. "Got all my paperwork in here. Military records, medical history, everything they asked for. Can't risk losing it. Last time I stayed at the shelter, someone stole my bag. Lost a month's worth of forms. Had to start the whole process over." A police car drove by slowly, its lights off but its presence noticed. Thompson watched it pass, then continued. "The shelters," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're good people there, doing what they can. But they're full most nights, And some of us vets, we don't do well in crowds. Too many people, too many noises, too many. He tapped his temple again, a gesture Martinez was beginning to understand. Found this bench 3 days ago, Thompson explained, patting the wooden slats beneath him. It's perfect, really. Well lit, which keeps the troublemakers away. Close to the VA office, just 2 blocks down. Can't risk missing this appointment. They said they might have a bed for me in their residential program. Martinez noticed how Thompson's voice changed when he mentioned the program. There was hope there, buried under layers of exhaustion and experience. The veteran pulled out his phone again, showing the screen. Set 3 alarms, just to be sure. Battery's good. Found an outlet at the library yesterday, charged it full. The night had grown colder, and Thompson's military jacket, despite its layers, wasn't enough to keep out the chill completely. Still, he sat straight, maintaining that military bearing that had been drilled into him years ago. "You know what's funny, officer?" Thompson said, though his smile held no humor. "When I was over there, I had a purpose. Every day, I knew what I had to do. Take care of my men, complete the mission, keep everyone alive. Now," he gestured at the dark park around them. "Now, I'd fight paper battles. Forms that get lost in the system. Phone calls that go nowhere. Waiting lists that never seem to end." He pulled out another paper from his jacket, a disability benefits application. The date on it was from 3 months ago. "They lost the first 2 I submitted," he explained. "This is my 3rd try." The lady at the VA office, she made copies this time. Said she'd help push it through. Tomorrow's meeting, it could change everything. Martinez noticed how Thompson's hands were shaking more now, but his voice remained steady. "My buddy from the unit, he went through the same thing last year. Finally got his benefits approved, got into housing. He calls me sometimes, tells me to hang in there. Says the system works, it just takes time." Thompson looked at his watch. Another habit that hadn't faded with time. 7 hours and 23 minutes until the office opens, he said, more to himself than to Martinez. Can't risk going too far. Can't risk missing this chance. The veteran's story hung in the cold night air between them. Every word painted a picture of a man caught between worlds. A warrior who'd fought for his country, now fighting a different kind of battle on its streets. The irony wasn't lost on Martinez, whose citation book remained untouched in his back pocket, feeling heavier with each passing moment. The clock on Martinez's patrol car dashboard showed midnight, marking the start of a new day. But for Thompson, it was just another hour to count down, another hour closer to what might be his last chance at getting the help he'd earned years ago on a battlefield half a world away. Officer Martinez sat quietly on the bench, feeling the cold seep through his uniform. His radio crackled with routine chatter. A noise complaint across town, a suspicious vehicle report, the usual midnight calls. But for the first time in his 8 years on the force, he wasn't reaching for his radio to respond. The citation book in his back pocket felt like a brick. Department policy was clear, no camping in public parks. He'd written dozens of these citations before. It was part of the job, keeping the parks clear, maintaining order. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just dealing with a policy violation, he was facing a moral crossroads. Martinez thought about his Uncle Robert, who'd served in a different war, but came home with the same haunted look he now saw in Thompson's eyes. Uncle Robert had been one of the lucky ones. He had family to help him through the rough patches. But he told stories about his military buddies who weren't so fortunate, men who'd fought for their country only to fight for survival on its streets. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant traffic. Martinez watched as Thompson unconsciously adjusted his position, trying to block the cold. The veteran's military jacket, which had probably once been a source of pride, now served as his only protection against the elements. "You know," Martinez said, breaking the silence, "my Uncle Robert was a Marine too." He wasn't sure why he shared this, maybe to bridge the gap between them, maybe to explain why he was still sitting here instead of writing that citation. "He used to tell me stories about his service, about the bonds you form over there." Thompson nodded, understanding flowing between them. "Your uncle, he made it back okay?" The question carried weight. They both knew okay meant more than just physical survival. He struggled, Martinez admitted, remembering the late-night conversations he overheard as a kid, his uncle's voice carrying through the thin walls. But he had family, people who understood, or at least tried to. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Not everyone has that. The city ordinance Martinez was supposed to enforce flickered through his mind. Municipal Code 18.1 the one prohibiting camping in public parks. The law made sense on paper, in city council meetings and police briefings. But here, in the cold reality of midnight, facing a man who'd given everything for his country, those rules felt hollow. Martinez thought about his own journey to becoming a police officer. He'd joined the force wanting to help people, to make a difference in his community. Now, sitting on this park bench, he realized sometimes helping people meant looking beyond the letter of the law to see the human story underneath. His hand touched the radio on his shoulder. One call could bring a patrol van, take Thompson to a precinct where he'd be processed, given a citation, and sent back to the streets. By the book, that's what should happen. But Martinez thought about Thompson's VA appointment in the morning, about the carefully organized paperwork in his backpack, about the 3 months of waiting that could all be undone by following protocol. The officer's mind wandered to the homeless outreach program they discussed in last month's department meeting. He'd taken their card, tucked it in his wallet more out of habit than intention. Now, for the first time, he found himself reaching for it, feeling its edges through the leather. Thompson sat quietly, probably reading the conflict on Martinez's face. The veteran had seen enough of life to understand the weight of decisions, the battle between duty and conscience. He wasn't begging for mercy or special treatment. There was still too much pride for that. He was simply waiting, with the same patience that had kept him going through 3 tours and countless VA waiting rooms. Martinez looked at his watch, 12:20 a.m. His shift would end in a few hours, and he'd go home to a warm bed while Thompson stayed here, counting down the hours until his appointment. The thought sat uncomfortably in his chest, like a weight he couldn't shake off. The radio crackled again, another routine call. Martinez reached up to adjust the volume, his fingers brushing against his badge. That piece of metal represented law and order, but it also represented protection and service. Tonight, he had to decide which aspect of that duty carried more weight. The citation book pressed against him as he shifted on the bench, a constant reminder of what department policy demanded. But his uncle's voice echoed in his head, telling stories of brothers in arms and the promises they made to never leave anyone behind. Now, years later and miles away from any battlefield, Martinez faced his own version of that promise. Martinez pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. The screen's glare lit up his face in the darkness as he scrolled through his contacts. 3 months on the Homeless Outreach Task Force had left him with a handful of numbers that most officers rarely used. Tonight, he was glad he'd saved them. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice cutting through the night air, "I'm going to make a call, if that's okay with you." He wasn't asking for permission, exactly, but something in him felt it was important to give Thompson that dignity, the right to have a say in what happened next. The veteran nodded, watching carefully as Martinez dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Linda, it's Officer Martinez." "Yeah, I know it's late." "Listen, I've got a situation." He walked a few steps away, his voice dropping as he explained the circumstances. While Martinez talked on the phone, Thompson sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't begging, wasn't asking for special treatment. There was still that military pride in his posture, the kind that couldn't be broken by hardship or time. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes. When Martinez returned to the bench, there was something different in his expression. "There's a 24-hour diner about 2 blocks from here," he said, putting his phone away. "How about we continue this conversation somewhere warmer? My treat." Thompson looked surprised, but then understanding crossed his face. It wasn't just about food. It was about being treated like a person again, not a problem to be solved. He gathered his backpack with military precision, making sure all his precious paperwork was secure. The walk to the diner was quiet, their footsteps echoing off empty storefronts. The neon sign of Pete's all-night dinner cut through the darkness, a beacon of warmth in the cold night. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and the smell of coffee and grilled onions filled the air. The waitress didn't bat an eye when a police officer and a homeless veteran walked in together at nearly 1 in the morning. She just grabbed 2 menus and led them to a booth near the back. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Yes, please," Thompson said, his voice carrying that ingrained politeness that the Marines had drilled into him. His hands shook slightly as he wrapped them around the warm mug, but his eyes were clearer now, more focused. Martinez ordered them both the full breakfast special, eggs, hash browns, toast, the works. As they waited for their food, he shared what he'd learned on the phone. Linda works with the Veterans Outreach Program. They've got a bed available at their transitional housing facility. It's not far from the VA office. Thompson's fork clapped against his coffee cup. A bed. His voice was steady, but his eyes gave away his surprise. But the waiting list. Linda says they keep a few spots open for emergency cases, Martinez explained, stirring his coffee. They can hold it for you for at least a week, give you time to make you a VA appointment, and get your paperwork sorted. The food arrived, steaming plates piled high with eggs and potatoes. Thompson stared at his plate for a moment, and Martinez pretended not to notice him blinking back tears. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of forks and the soft music playing from the diner's old jukebox. As they ate, Thompson slowly shared more of his story. He talked about the day he'd saved his fellow Marines, not with pride, but with a quiet sort of sadness. He described the explosion, the chaos, the split-second decisions that had earned him his Purple Heart. But more than the combat stories, he talked about his friends, the ones who made it and the ones who didn't. "You know what I miss most?" Thompson said, pushing his empty plate aside. "Not the house, or the job, or even the marriage. I miss having a purpose. Over there, every day mattered. Every decision could save a life or lose one. Here," he gestured vaguely at the world outside the diner's windows. Martinez listened, really listened, the way his uncle had taught him. Sometimes, he knew, the most important part of helping someone wasn't what you did. It was showing them they weren't invisible, that their story mattered. The diner's clock ticked past 2 a.m. Thompson's VA appointment was getting closer, but now, instead of a cold park bench, he had somewhere to go. Martinez watched as the veteran carefully folded his napkin, old habits showing through, and realized that sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest decisions. 6 months had passed since that cold night in the park. Officer Martinez stood at the back of a crowded police training room, watching as Thompson adjusted the microphone at the podium. The veteran looked different now, clean-shaven, wearing pressed khakis and a collared shirt, his military bearing now a source of pride rather than a remnant of the past. "I wasn't sure about speaking today," Thompson began, his voice steady as he addressed the room full of police officers. "But Officer Martinez here convinced me that my story might help others understand." He paused, making eye contact with the officers in the room. 6 months ago, I was sleeping on a park bench. Today, I'm here to talk about how one officer's decision changed everything. Martinez remembered driving Thompson to the veterans' shelter that night after leaving the diner. The building hadn't looked like much from the outside, but Thompson had straightened his jacket and squared his shoulders before walking in, dignity intact. Martinez had slipped his card into Thompson's hand before leaving, not a requirement, just a promise that someone cared. Thompson continued his speech, describing his journey over the past 6 months. The VA appointment had gone through, the first domino in a series of positive changes. The shelter had helped him navigate the benefits system, and within weeks, his disability claim was processing. More importantly, they'd connected him with a counselor who understood military trauma. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork, Thompson told the room. It was learning to trust again. Learning to believe that people wanted to help, that I deserved that help. His voice carried through the quiet room as he described the small victories, his first night in a real bed, his first session with the counselor, the day his benefits finally came through. Martinez had kept in touch, stopping by the shelter every couple of weeks. He'd watched Thompson's progress, seen him start group therapy, seen him begin helping other veterans navigate the system he'd learned to master. The tremor in Thompson's hands had slowly steadied, though it never completely went away. 3 months ago, I moved into my own apartment, Thompson announced, a hint of pride in his voice. Small place, nothing fancy, but it's mine. Got a job too, part-time at the VA office. Turns out all that experience fighting with paperwork made me pretty good at helping others do the same. The room was silent as Thompson described how he now spent his days helping other veterans avoid the pitfalls he'd faced. He'd become a bridge between two worlds, understanding both the struggles of the streets and the maze of bureaucracy that often trapped his fellow veterans. "But that's not why I'm here today," Thompson said, his voice growing serious. "I'm here because what happened that night in the park wasn't just about finding me a bed or getting me to my appointment. It was about being seen as a person, not a problem." Officer Martinez could have written that citation. Instead, he chose to listen. Martinez felt the eyes of his fellow officers on him, but he kept his gaze on Thompson. The veteran was sharing their story not for praise, but to show what was possible when law enforcement looked beyond the surface, when they saw the human being behind the circumstance. "Every person you meet on those streets has a story," Thompson continued. "Some of us wore uniforms like I did. Others fought different kinds of battles. But we all need the same thing, to be treated with dignity, to be given a chance." Thompson reached the end of his speech, pulling out something from his pocket. It was the old photograph of his Marine unit, the one he'd shown Martinez that night in the park. But now it was in a new frame, protected and preserved, just like the memories it held. "6 months ago, this photo was all I had left," Thompson said, holding it up. "Today, it's a reminder of where I've been, but not where I'm stuck." And that change started with one simple thing. An officer who chose to see me as a veteran having a rough time, not just another homeless person in the park. The room erupted in applause as Thompson finished speaking. Officers came forward to shake his hand, to share their own stories of family members who'd served. Martinez watched from the back, remembering that cold night and the weight of the citation book he'd chosen not to use. Later, as the room cleared out, Thompson approached Martinez. "Still got your card," he said, pulling out his wallet. The card was worn now, but still legible. "Keep it to remind myself that sometimes help comes from unexpected places." Martinez smiled, remembering his uncle's words about how no one ever really fights their battles alone. That night 6 months ago, he'd made a choice between following protocol and following his conscience. Looking at Thompson now, standing tall, helping others, rebuilding his life, he knew he'd made the right call. As they walked out of the training room together, Thompson turned to Martinez. "You know what the best part is?" he asked. "Now when I help other vets, I can tell them my story. Show them it's possible to start over. Sometimes that's all people need, to know someone else made it through."